Now it's our pleasure this evening to welcome in our midst an individual who has some incredible insight into the political workings in this country, Mr. John W. Dean. As most of you know, John Dean was the White House counsel for U.S. President Richard Nixon between July 1970 until April 1973. He became prominent in public attention during his riveting testimony before the Irwin Watergate impeachment hearing. Mr. Dean was born in Akron, Ohio, and began his undergraduate studies at Colgate University, majoring in English literature. He then went on to the College of Worcester in Worcester, Ohio, and completed an undergraduate degree in political science in 1961. John and I were just reminiscing on that because, as it turns out, I got my undergraduate degree from the College of Worcester 1 year earlier. As is typical of a lot of campuses, we may have had contact with each other, but it's maybe it's a thing about memory. I'm not sure. After receiving his law degree from Georgetown University in 1965, Mr. Dean joined a Washington, D.C. law firm, and he was subsequently employed as chief minority counsel of the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee. He then progressed from a key position on the National Commission on the Reform of the Federal Criminal Law to become an associate deputy in the Office of the Attorney General of the United States. In July 1970, Mr. Dean succeeded John Ehrlichman to become counsel to President Richard Nixon, and the rest, as the expression would have it, is history. Post-Watergate, Mr. Dean became an investment banker, author, columnist, and lecturer. Many of us in this room are familiar with the sound of Mr. Dean's voice from his regular appearance and keen analysis featured on the Keith Olbermann Countdown program on MSNBC. His books include Blind Ambition, Lost Honor, The Rehnquist Choice, Worse Than Watergate, Conservatives Without Conscience, and his latest book, Broken Government. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. John Dean.
I was in San Diego a couple of weeks ago. Just as the fires were starting and leaving and seeing the smoke come up in the background. I hope none of you all were affected by that. Certainly a frightening experience for all of us. I know I certainly feel a little bit better now that George Bush has been out. He didn't dress up as a fireman. How can you say that mission was accomplished? Let me share a little bit with you about these books. It's actually a genre I'd like to write myself out of. I promised myself when I was in business that when I turned 60 I would return to writing. I had enjoyed it. I had done a couple books. I've now done 8. I'm actually working on 9 and 10. That's my retirement. I started as a bi-weekly columnist, which I've now been doing for about 7 some years at an online site called FindLaw. That is, it's actually surprised me how widely read it is, because online they can actually record at least how many people click it on and open it up, so you have some sense of how many people are looking at what you're doing. And I noticed very early, the group of columnists for FindLaw are principally law professors. I'm probably the only one that's not a law professor. Or they're former Supreme Court law clerks. They're all very eminent, able lawyers, and I very quickly headed in a very political direction. And as the hits started increasing on my column, I think the word went out amongst the editors, and I noticed that more and more over the succeeding 7 years, less of the esoteric points of what the Supreme Court might be arguing are addressed, and much more of the practical, legal, day-to-day diet of government is being addressed. So it's been a fun site to work on. And I began in 2000, shortly before Bush arrived, and when Bush arrived, I realized as a former White House counsel very quickly that these people had not only started during the campaign, but as soon as they moved in, they sort of pulled the shades and slammed the door and started stiff-arming the press and issuing quietly executive orders that were repealing every effort of prior presidents to put some transparency in the highest office in the land. I'd be the first to tell you that no president can operate a fishbowl, but there are limits, and there is some degree of understanding, at least that's been tacit for a long time, that the American voters are entitled to have some glimmering of what's happening with their president. And I was struck by the fact that this president didn't really feel that way. I did notice during the transition that Cheney had taken charge. I still have a lot of contacts in Washington. I live here in California. I live up lived in Beverly Hills for 30-some years, and I hate to buy my own house today. But I do give back to Washington a great deal, and as I say, I have a lot of friends back there. In fact, one friend who I will raise just because I want to make it clear he is not one of my sources, and that is my former deputy, Fred Fielding, is now, of course, George Bush's White House counsel. I'm not quite sure why he took the job. I've suspected for a few years that Fred has been sipping the Kool-Aid. And I also know that his daughter was working for Dick Cheney, and he had become close to the vice president, so it didn't really surprise me totally when they needed somebody with some credibility after Gonzalez had left the post to go over to show that he had no credibility as Attorney General to fill that slot in the White House. The Washington that I'm writing about and have been writing about, and it started, as I say, with columns trying to send some flares up for these people to say, listen, we're not everybody out here in the hustings is as dumb as you think. But the mainstream media was ignoring most of the things I was writing about at the time, particularly the excessive secrecy, so I thought, well, at least somebody should be covering this, and I noticed really this almost staggering number of hits my columns were getting, and I said, well, people really want to know about this. So I have kept writing on that vein. I don't write one that will go off the charts every week, because I try to dig in. These pieces we do are fairly in-depth. They're about 1,500 to 2,000 words. We really kind of dig into a subject. If you did that every week, you'd spend every week doing that all week and nothing else. So we can't give everything the same kind of attention, but it's certainly much more in-depth than our blogs, for example. But it was a great chance to kind of work out my thinking, and I very quickly realized that even with 1,500 to 2,000 words, there's only so much you can say, and somebody needed to put out the fact that we have the most secret presidency we've ever had. And I could speak with some experience about what was one of the predecessor, probably the most previous secret presidency was Richard Nixon's. So, and by comparison, I was struck that Nixon, for example, actually did try, for his own motives, which I'll tell you in a moment, to declassify an awful lot of prior classified material. The material he wanted declassified was some very remote stuff from World War II and World War I even, and as well as Korea, because he thought it would embarrass the Democrats. So it was not without a political motive that Nixon wanted to get this material declassified and out for historians to mull over and talk about. But nevertheless, it was an opening of government rather than a closing of government, and this philosophy of just closing it up and keeping it so nobody knows what's going on is, particularly after Clinton, who declassified something like 1 billion documents during his presidency. It was a staggering amount. While yes, he may have had some affairs in the Oval Office. Well, actually, he kept the draperies open when he was in the Oval Office. He was not a particularly secretive guy, as it turned out, even when he was misbehaving. That's another story. We don't want to go there tonight. But anyway, I wrote this book, The Worse Than Watergate, The Secret Presidency of George Bush. I happen to realize now that was probably a bad title. And I say that for this reason. It was actually, and I'm certainly not an apologist for Watergate, but it was and is much worse than Watergate. Because you look at the so-called litany of activities that constitute the abuses of power that occurred during the presidency of Richard Nixon, and there is nobody who dies as a result of any of those abuses of power. Nobody is tortured as a result of those abuses of power. Millions of Americans aren't subject to government surveillance for their electronic communications in foreign countries. We're really playing in a very different league today. The whole debate that's been going on with Judge Mukasey's nomination to be Attorney General and his refusal to declare that waterboarding is torture is really quite a commentary on how far we have descended as a nation. The ramification, I'm somebody who travels around the world a lot, and it's gotten very embarrassing because I do a lot of public speaking abroad as well, and to try to defend and explain what our country is doing is very difficult today, because it is so different, and the disrespect with which we are now held, particularly after the feelings and the powerful feelings, truly powerful feelings that people had towards all of you and all of us after 9/11, has been totally dissipated in the ensuing years. It's really rather sad. Anyway, the Worse Than Watergate book started what would become a trilogy that I had not planned. In fact, it's a trilogy that I would like to, or I shouldn't say it's a genre that I would like to write myself out of, because while I do understand my former tribe, and I can talk about them the way few can because of my ability to get in and know what they're up to and why they're up to it, enough is enough, and I hope we don't have that need. I was actually at lunch today with my wife Maureen, telling her, I'm saying, the only way I could see having to continue this, and I sure hope that doesn't happen, would be if Rudy Giuliani somehow got in the White House. And that was prompted after Pat Robertson today endorsed him. And I said, anything's possible. And boy, if he's there, that's Bush and Cheney on steroids. Actually, I heard a better one. I heard a rather interesting one. I heard Mitt Romney compared to Nixon on Prozac. But Giuliani is Nixon on crystal meth. Which isn't bad. Somebody who knows all those players. But that, as I say, it's a genre I hope I don't have to continue, and that would probably be the case. I would find it necessary to just keep writing this stuff, because another reason I have written these books is that Democrats don't like to talk about these things. After I wrote Worse Than Watergate, I was pretty sure that the secrecy of the Bush administration would be a major issue in 2004. I didn't light it to that purpose, but I just thought, how could you ignore that issue? Because by the time when I started the book, nobody was talking about it. By the time the book was out, there was more and more talk about it. In fact, about a week or 10 days before the election, the New York Times did a op-ed piece. Actually, it wasn't an op-ed, it was a bottom of the editorial page, because they give the editors who write the editorials that space in the bottom from time to time. And one of the editors from the Times had said, in essence, to John Kerry, as the Democratic standard bearer, don't you notice the secrecy in Washington, Mr. Kerry? And don't you think you ought to be raising that with voters? Don't you think they'd be interested in the fact that we have the most secret presidency we've ever had? And it's created some real problems. We don't even know what all they're doing. And what we do is troublesome enough in what we don't know. And obviously after Kerry lost, and that issue had not come up during the campaign, my curiosity was so piqued that I decided to call the Kerry campaign and find out why in the world they hadn't raised this issue. It was just too important. It was just too fundamental. And it was too important to just totally give them a pass on. And I did. After they had a chance to recover from the loss, I called the top of the campaign rather than call the candidate. I decided to call the campaign because this had clearly been a campaign-wide decision. So I wanted to talk to the people who were the decision makers in the campaign. And they told me, yes, we saw the problem and we were troubled by the problem, but we didn't raise it for a very simple reason, John. It's a process issue. And we don't believe voters are interested in process issues. I said, what? I said, if you know as well as I know that process is the name of the game in Washington. And at that point, I hadn't studied polling, I hadn't done anything. This was the first time I'd ever heard anybody say that process wasn't of interest to voters. So I then asked a number of Democratic congressional campaign or candidates who had run against incumbents who were vulnerable. They had had close races and lost them, to see if they had raised the process issue or if this was a wider problem within the Democratic Party. And sure enough, I found that they would say, they didn't say the leadership, they hinted that this may have been a leadership decision to not raise process issues. I'd say, you didn't think it was important to tell the voters that under the Republican control of Congress, you're only working 2 days a week? That when there's a conference committee to sort out the difference between the House and the Senate, with Republicans controlling that conference committee, they won't even meet if a Democrat shows up? You don't think it's important to tell voters that when legislation is being written now, it's not being written in committees, it's being written on K Street and brought up to the Hill and slipped in often late at night after votes have been opened, or it's been added to a conference report that no Democrats attended, that you have been totally removed from the deliberative process of the House, that they refuse to follow what is called regular order in Washington? You don't think those? Well, we do think those are important, but we also were sort of told that we would be wimpy if we were found complaining about these issues. Well, this is when I began looking around to see if indeed there was any academic or hard empirical data on process and how people, the voter, the average voter, feels about this issue. And I found a team over at Nebraska, University of Nebraska, Lincoln, who indeed had, while most political scientists have ignored this question, this team happened to run into it quite by mistake when they were merely studying why people feel so harshly and negatively about Congress in general. Why it always has, of all the three branches, the lowest approval ratings. They discovered in the process of that work that indeed somewhere as you translate their material, between about 20 and 30 million voters think process is the most important issue. That's a significant number. Because they weren't looking for it, they suspect that number could be even higher. But this is what just came out by accident that they realize that these are people who look first at process. They're people who understand if the process is working well, you tend to get good policies. When the process is screwed up, it doesn't work well at all. There are people who may not be able, most people can't tell you, for example, how Republicans are using, say, the motion to recommit in the House to defeat all the efforts of the Democrats to get things through. Most people can't tell you exactly why we had all the shenanigans earlier this week on Monday, or Tuesday, Monday, when Dennis Kucinich offered his impeachment amendment, and at the last minute, rather than table it, the Republicans decided to vote to bring it to a debate on the floor on Monday, to which forced the Democrats in turn to scramble on a straight party vote and send it to the House Judiciary Committee. They don't understand the nuance of all those policy moves. They can't tell you, for example, how it is and why it is and why it's working the way it is, that all of the things that are happening in the House, some 85, 90 bills now, have gone over and are being held, or they're under a threat of filibuster, so they're moving nowhere in the Senate, giving the public the impression the Democrats are doing nothing and they can't run the place at all. This, of course, is how the Republicans originally won the House in '94. They did it by trying to destroy the institution. They pulled every shenanigan and trick you can think of, including one I cite in Broken Government, that I remember it at the time. I was so stunned to see it, where a member of the House walked around on the floor of the House with a paper bag on his head. And when he came out of the chamber, the members of the press quite naturally asked him, "Why do you have the paper bag on your head?" And he said, "Well, I'm so ashamed to be a part of this body. I don't want anybody to see me." Well, that sort of stuff had an impression and helped the Democrats to lose control of Congress that they held for 40 years. Indeed, there were some reasons they deserved to lose it, because they had gotten a little bit overconfident and they had let a lot of the processes slip themselves. But it's nothing like what the Republicans would do when they did take control, and after a couple of years of trying to actually do some reform, decide, well, that won't work, and they decided to run it only for Republicans, in essence squeezing out over half, not just half, over half of the American people who are represented by Democrats in Congress. So this is a fundamental change in the constitutional nature of the way that system works. I do this through each branch, and in Broken Government, and I looked at it from a perspective not of everything these people had done wrong. To the contrary, I tried to look at the big picture. What are they doing that's really messing with the way the system is supposed to work? Because in each instance, I found that's exactly what they had done. When they rule, they don't like the way the Constitution actually requires them to operate. So they have pushed and pushed and pushed. These are the people who will, in one breath, tell you they are strict constructionists, they are originalists, they believe in what the founders have to say, but you give them the power to run the institution, and they can care less, because it doesn't quite fit into the way they want to operate. The reason I say this is a genre I'd like to write myself out of is because I'm disappointed in my former tribe. It's not pleasant I still have a lot of friends in the Republican Party. A lot of them are unhappy with what I'm doing. Others, for example, when I did the Conservatives Without Conscience book, where a book I had originally started with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, who I had known since I was about 14 years of age, because his son and I have been longtime friends, because we were once roommates. When I finally did that book, a lot of Republicans would say, "Thank you for explaining what has happened to the Republican Party," when I discovered indeed what had become of them, how they have really devolved into a small group of what can only be called authoritarian conservatives. What I did is I read into a body of science that really was developed in the aftermath of World War II, where a group up at Berkeley decided to ask the question, could what happened in Nazi Germany ever happen here? Would Americans ever tolerate Hitler? Would they ever stand for a Holocaust? The short answer, and which they published in the early 50s, was yes, there is an authoritarian personality who will submit to this type of behavior and tolerate it. In fact, feel very comfortable with it. The book was subject to some legitimate criticism. It was based on Freudian psychology, which has never been proven wrong, but never been proven right. So other social scientists, and now this has been going on for over a half century, decided to look at this from an empirical standpoint and ask people questions and say, are there really people out there who do this, who follow leaders this easily? And they have found, yes, indeed, there is a segment of our population who very easily submit to an authoritarian leader. And once they do, they become very aggressive in pushing that worldview. They're both men and women. They're often bullies. They don't want to hear another point of view once they have accepted this particular outlook. They don't want to be challenged. They don't want to have anybody tell them they're wrong because they are convinced of the correctness of the position they have been told is the position they should think. They don't want to think for themselves. It's more work than they really want to engage in. And so they fall into this very easily. In fact, after 9/11, we saw what is a core in this country of about 25% grow considerably as authoritarian followers. This science has also looked at authoritarian leaders. Who are they? They are called social dominators. They're people who will jump in front of any crowd and say, follow me. They are people who, when there's somebody in front of them who is a leader, will do everything they can to cut that person off at the knees and lessen their leadership skills so they can get at them. They are highly Machiavellian. They are totally amoral. They are typically men. They are seldom religious, whereas the follower is typically highly religious. The leader is seldom, other than the fact that it helps him to manipulate those who he wants to have follow, will he be religious. So these are real people out there, and this isn't what social scientists call them. It's what they call themselves after tens upon tens of thousands of anonymous tests over now a half century. This is a solid body of science. And when I first read that stuff, I said to myself, whoa, I know a lot of those people. I worked with them at the Nixon White House. But I also know a lot of them who've come along since. And that would become my book, Conservatives Without Conscience. As I say, a lot of Republicans were not happy with that book. A lot of others, however, who were on the fence, wrote me and said, thank you for explaining what we didn't understand. I can't tell you how many people have told me, I now understand my father or my friend or somebody like that who just doesn't want to hear any other point of view. But you can pretty much bet that that's going to be an authoritarian conservative, an authoritarian follower personality. And they're very comfortable in their position, and they're not going to change. The likelihood of you convincing them otherwise is almost impossible once they become believers. So you're not going to convert them. The best thing you can do is understand them. That's the best thing. There is, as I say, a segment that will grow and fall back because they're not really authoritarian personalities, but a 9/11 type event will cause them to do that. The social scientist testing showed those numbers grew tremendously after 9/11. So that book looked, if you will, at why these people are acting the way they were acting, whereas Broken Government, the third in the trilogy, I felt I had to explain what they're doing to the system. I looked at it in Conservatives Without Conscience. I passed a little bit into the way they operate in the House. I did that because it was an off-year election, and I wanted people to have that information for 2006. But I came back and then put it all together in the Broken Government. The thing you should understand about the big problem with the executive branch is very simple. A archetypical authoritarian conservative leader has literally swallowed the presidency. His name is Dick Cheney. I'm not sure it was planned this way, but it's happened this way. Maybe Cheney saw it. Maybe he saw the weaknesses in Bush when he first signed on for the job. But he has, I think, been something of a genius in the job, because he lets Bush wake up every morning and actually think he's president. And it is not a small ego that runs for this job. And so the decider wants to decide. And the decider is deciding, but he's deciding what Dick Cheney wants him to decide. I've written about this in all three of these books, and I was delighted when the Washington Post first, a reporter by the name of Joe Baker, after interviewing about 200 people, came to the identical conclusion when she called me when she was working on another article on Fred Thompson. And I said, well, Joe, you could have just looked at my books. I put a lot of evidence in there right there. She said, I did. And she said, I just felt I wanted to get independent evidence of it. Well, I said, I thank you for corroborating my finding. And Frontline recently did the same. So this is pretty solid now, and it's not really something that's up for debate. And how it will play in history, I don't think it's going to make Bush look any better because Cheney was making the decisions or actually running the show. He's a former White House chief of staff. He knows how the place runs. He knows exactly how to do this. And he knows Bush has no interest or disposition to get into the things of the real lifeblood of the presidency, which are like personnel and budget matters. They're dull for somebody who's not really into this, whereas they're probably the most important thing that happened. And these decisions never get to the Oval Office. They're resolved at Cheney's level. And he has also dictated policy right across the board. The debate on torture, there is no doubt in my mind that that has come out of Cheney's office, and it's probably come and been pretty well and systematically justified by his first counsel, now chief of staff, David Addington, who's had a very curious career. He was at the CIA at one point during Bill Casey's tenure, and when Casey died, Cheney made sure he was protected and brought him over to the Department of Defense. Took him to the Capitol Hill first, where Cheney was still out on the Hill during the Iran-Contra. And so you've got Cheney's #1 guy, and Cheney is he's the ranking member of the Iran-Contra investigation, who is up to his neck in helping Casey run the Iran-Contra matter. So it is little surprise that the minority came out where they did, and Addington was right there protecting himself and the others all the way along. He took him over to defense, and then when he came back into government, he of course brought him right back in with it. Interesting guy, because I'm very curious to know how Fred Fielding would deal with an Addington. Addington, I could see absolutely eating alive an Alberto Gonzales. Addington is an in-your-face, red-faced, swearing, pounding on the table type of argument lawyer. Fielding is just the opposite. Very low-key, but knowledgeable. And Addington's knowledgeable. Poor Alberto Gonzales was over his head from the day he was there. He might be a great real estate lawyer, but he sure as hell didn't know anything about the way Washington worked, and I suspected he was in trouble from day one, which proved true. And I don't think his troubles have ended by any stretch of the imagination. So what Cheney has done, and the way I spring into this in this chapter is I was stunned to find as many historians or presidential watchers across the political spectrum saying that we have the worst presidency we've ever had. And it wasn't the usual suspects. It runs from Bill Buckley saying if this man were a prime minister, he would have resigned long ago, to a former editor of the National Review making a powerful argument in the American Conservative that we have the worst president, down to historians that are on the left who make it equally powerful. And as I sorted through those and what decisions they thought, because I thought nobody would ever top James Buchanan, who took us into the Civil War, and had always been my #1 ranking president. I actually did a book on Warren Harding and for Arthur Schlesinger. Arthur, when I learned he was going to do that presidential series he was doing on all 42 past presidents, I had known Arthur for years, so I called him and I said, obviously, Arthur, I shouldn't ask to do Nixon and wouldn't ask to do Nixon, but I said, I'll bet you don't know who to assign Harding to. And he said, boy, are you right there. And I said, well, I grew up in Harding's hometown in Marion, Ohio. He was my first president. I have every book that's ever been written about him on my shelf, so it's a project that I can do pretty quickly. And I've always thought that, while I've never really sat down to try to write it up, that Warren Harding has gotten a bad rap in history. He said, well, I'll be interested to see what you have to say on that, because I've never had anything very nice to say about Warren Harding. And when I turned my manuscript in, Schlesinger called me and he said, well, I was wrong. You've turned me around. What happened is nobody's ever looked at Harding's presidential papers. Everybody thought they were burned. I also told Arthur, I said, you know, Arthur, I feel a little bit of an obligation here. You bring one president down, you got to bring another one up. So Bush, in looking at the way historians were dealing with him, it was so striking, and I went back to see what the core issue was, and it was always Cheney, a Cheney-based decision. And then I began looking at Cheney's history, and Cheney has boasted on his history and his claims. Since he arrived, he has said, you know, Watergate and Vietnam so weakened the presidency it can't effectively deal with terrorism. Well, I knew that was a fallacious argument. I knew it because during the Reagan administration, they started rebuilding the presidency. It became part of the conservative mantra. So rather than me just reciting this, I found a young Harvard-trained PhD who was too young to have any first-hand knowledge of Watergate or any disposition, and a seemingly very straight down the middle, let me tell you what the facts tell you type of analyst, and looked at his material. He wrote a book called The New Imperial Presidency, and he absolutely decimates the argument that Cheney makes, that when they inherited the presidency in 2000 or 2001, it was a weaker institution. That is just a fallacious argument. But I wanted to go back and look at the attitudes that Cheney has been espousing, because a lot of people have said, and I have talked to them, these are people who are mutual friends. You know, we don't understand Cheney today. He is not the person we recall or remember. He's just a different guy. We don't understand him. Well, I've always thought that the higher somebody goes in office, they don't change. The office doesn't really change the man or woman. It reveals them. And I think it has done that with Cheney. It has just revealed who he really is. And I say that particularly after looking back at the material he has boasted that people should look at, going back to his minority report on the Iran-Contra, and deconstructing that document. And it is the first time I realized, I had suspected this in reading other things, but when working on this last book, that I realized the dishonesty that has crept into conservative scholarship, because it used to be just the opposite. They were sticklers for being honest about their analysis. And now, because as many of you know, I still consider myself in many regards a Goldwater conservative. And that, of course, puts me well left of center today. I'm on the liberal side, progressive side, and I haven't really changed my views that much in all these years. But as I say, it just, in fact, his papers and his own view was that history would look back on him as a liberal. And I think that's probably right. He is a classic liberal. He comes from the classic school of liberalism, and proudly so. And one of the reasons we were going to do that book together that I ended up doing is because he said, I don't understand what's happened to conservatism. I just don't know where these people are going. I don't know what's in their head. And that's why I undertook that search. But anyway, looking at Cheney and looking at where he wants to go and looking at the scholarship that he was relying on, I discovered that it is so dishonest. I mean, openly fraudulent. I raised it in a very gentle and broad way in Broken Government, but I also at one point decided I better put an appendix in this book. And my first editor is always my wife, Mo. And because she is not a big nonfiction reader, she's a news junkie and always has been. But she's got a very keen eye, and she will tell me if something is deadly dull or boring or too legalistic. And when I gave this argument to her about, where this scholarship is going, she said, "Wow, that's really interesting." And I did. I took John Yoo, who has written all of the key memos that the basis of support for, first of all, torture and then going to war in Iraq, and it is dishonest scholarship. It is, if he tried to present those arguments in a court, a judge would probably take his law license. But these are the arguments that the Bush administration went to war on. And I decided this deserved an appendix and doing it in a very lay way. Anyway, the most important thing I discovered, because I want to open this up for questions and have an exchange with you. The most important thing I discovered was I should have spotted and anticipated and was least thinking about until I actually started looking at how Republicans have handled the federal judiciary. And what they have done is they have politicized the non-political branch. It starts with Richard Nixon in the '68 campaign when he promises the South that he will select strict constructionist judges if they elect him, and he honors his pledge. At one point, the White House sent over a memo, this is just before I arrived, to then the head of the Office of Legal Counsel, a fellow by the name of Bill Rehnquist, who would later become an Associate Justice and Chief Justice. They asked Rehnquist, what is a strict constructionist, just so we can be clear on this, because it's a pretty vague term, although Nixon had used it throughout the '68 campaign. Bush uses it today. Conservatives throw it around. And I think that Rehnquist's answer is fascinating. I'm just going to paraphrase it for you. But he said, in essence, after sifting through a lot of law and a lot of thought, he wrote back to the White House. He said, a strict constructionist judge is a judge who favors prosecutors and also favors defendants in civil rights and civil liberties cases. That's pretty devastating. That tells you what a strict constructionist judge really does. It's not that he doesn't legislate from the bench. In fact, anytime any conservative tells you, we don't want judges who legislate from the bench, we don't want judicial activists, just cite Bush v. Gore.
Yeah.
That is pure judicial activism. I won't ask you to cite the esoteric studies that have been done that show the Rehnquist court is the most activist court in history. They have repealed more acts of Congress than any of their predecessors. This is judicial activism. So this is a myth that conservatives try to sell, and a lot of people who don't know better buy it. But anyway, what I found in looking at the way Nixon had politicized the court is he makes a promise in the campaign that he will select and put on the bench, on the high court, if he has openings, and he knew he would, strict constructionist judges. It goes from there and then becomes in Republican campaign, after the '68 campaign, in every single campaign, the Republicans promise a major constituency, and particularly it would become the religious right, that they will appoint their types of judges to the court. This is the quid pro quo. It isn't written, it's just understood. And they have honored that pledge. And as a result, this is what turned the confirmation process ugly. It has resulted, to my surprise again, in the Democrats not really contesting a lot of these judges getting on. And it's not the conservative judges, you'll find out, that trouble me. It's a certain type of conservative. It's what I call a fundamentalist. These are pretty frightening people. We have 4 of them on the court right now. We actually had 5. We had a total of 5. Rehnquist died. He was the first, and I have apologized for him since I was responsible for that nomination. Just having to be at the right place at the right time when Nixon was groping and find the right appointee. And I thought I knew Bill Rehnquist. I didn't know Bill Rehnquist. I was very disheartened when he dissembled, literally lied to the Senate about his history to get the job. When I was asked to go over and celebrate his confirmation, I just passed. He was not the person I thought, and it only went downhill from there, because when he was reappointed by Reagan, he had to protect the lies he had made in 1971 when Nixon had first appointed him. So he lied. The other fundamentalist judges have lied, with the exception of Scalia, who went up in the aftermath of the second appointment of Rehnquist by Ronald Reagan. He would send Rehnquist up to be Chief Justice to take the seat that Bornberger was holding, and Rehnquist would draw so much fire, the Senate was exhausted and decided to give Scalia a pass. He went on the court like 98-0 a vote. I don't think the members of the Senate even had a clue what his thinking was on issues. And they also knew he was a son of Italy, and they didn't want to, they had a lot of Italians in their districts, they didn't want to cause any problems, so they just let him sail right on. Thomas was another story. As I explained in the book, in fact I ran into Anita Hill very recently, about 10 days ago when I was up in Boston, and was giving a talk, and was delighted to find her. She's up at Wellesley right now, and this is over at Brandeis, and we had a nice visit. She had read the book in the part I talk about her hearings. But let me first talk about what was the most absurd lie that Thomas made, was when he told, in fact he almost lost his good conservative supporters when he did this. He told the confirmation hearing that he had no opinion whatsoever on Roe v. Wade. No opinion whatsoever. He had cited it in law terms, but no opinion on it. Well, those who were working his war room, who had talked to him, conservatives, hard right people who had talked to him before he'd gotten an appointment, said they knew this was a lie. They knew exactly what his position was on it. He hated it. He thought it should be overturned. Didn't like it. And they almost walked out because the lie was so blatant. They didn't, but they were very distressed by it. Even his strongest defenders and those who've written biographies that are very pro-Thomas cannot really resolve this issue. That was the most blatant of the lies. The most difficult to tolerate, in a sense, was the position he took with Anita Hill. That was clearly a remarkable performance. She did not want to come forward and explain that he had sexually harassed her when working for him. She, in fact, others had done it on her behalf because she, at the time, had contemporaneously told a number of people about how her boss was sexually harassing her. Of course, we all know that the consequences of the way the Senate handled that, and it was terrible the way the Senate handled it, particularly when you look at the fact that Joe Biden, who was the chairman of the committee, is now running for president. I haven't heard anybody asking this question yet. He sat on witnesses who could have corroborated Anita Hill, other women who had been harassed by Thomas, that supported her position. Why? It's been kind of fuzzy why. He said, well, he was afraid the women would get beat up the way she was getting beat up. Well, that isn't a very good excuse. These were women who were willing and able to testify, just like when Anita Hill finally realized she should do it and did do it. Inexplicable. I don't understand why he sat on this evidence. but it would come out later. And if you look at the record, Anita Hill has no motive whatsoever to lie about what had happened in those years. Clarence Thomas had every reason in the world. He was looking at a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. And he did just that. I don't think there's any question he lied. And he hid also his highly fundamentalist views. So those are two. Scalia and Thomas are on the court. Now we've got two more. And most in the Senate who have followed these things, who I talk to, both staff and members of the Senate, they are convinced that both John Roberts and Sam Alito lied to them. Now they're a little smoother, they're a little bit different temperament, not quite as blustery. They're certainly not they're not Borks, but they are clearly fundamentalist conservatives. Now, what's this all mean? Well, I actually decided, since this could be esoteric stuff, to take and explain exactly where these people, if they had one more vote, they had 5 votes on the court. If another vacancy, and it's highly likely we're going to get another vacancy for sure in the next term. You've got John Paul Stevens, who's in his 80s, while he seems in good health, anything can happen at that age. You've got Ruth Ginsburg, who is in her 70s, had problems with cancer. And you've got David Souter, who does not want to sit on the court if it's a fundamentalist court. He was appalled at what, and almost resigned over Bush v. Gore. And you can be sure he will leave, indeed, if one more gets an appointment, one more fundamentalist. So it could happen before Bush leaves. And if that happens, you've got my classmate from Georgetown, Pat Leahy, has got to say, just like he did with Ted Olson when they wanted to put him in as Attorney General, I won't confirm him. He's got to say, we won't confirm any justice until after the election. This is the decision the American people must make. We're not going to do it. It's got to be decided. It is a national referendum issue because it will forever change, not forever, but for decades change the nature of American law. Too big an issue to just slide through. So it's also got to be an issue in 2008, because most people don't realize what a dramatic change one more seat will make if these people get it. And so I have taken all the key areas of law where the fundamentalists have spoken, and you just project it quite slightly and see where they'll take it. And it is pretty frightening. Let me just give you one simple example, and then we'll open this up for Q&A, because I want to also end tonight on the fact I happen to be a glass half full type. I'm not a pessimist. I actually believe just knowing these things helps us deal with them. But let me take one example of where a fundamentalist court would take us. They don't believe the Bill of Rights apply to the states. Now, lawyers will understand the doctrine I'm about to talk about. It's called the doctrine of incorporation. What happened when the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were written? They were written for the federal government, not for the states. They were written for the feds, the federal machinery, not to apply. Each state some had bills of rights, some didn't. Some had bills of rights before. We even adopted our Constitution. Others had been since. But it was written for the federal government. And in federal court, you could only apply it when you were dealing with an issue of the federal government. We fought a civil war, however. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, a number of amendments were adopted, not only ending slavery, but also the 14th Amendment, which changed the name of the game for states, many of the people who debated the Fourth Amendment, while they didn't spell this out, they made it very clear in the debates when they talked about the language in the 14th Amendment, because as you know, constitutional language is very broad, very general. What they had in mind was incorporating the rights that are spelled out, the rights of free speech, the rights of freedom of religion, the right to a speedy trial, the rights against self-incrimination. All those things we're very familiar with in the Bill of Rights. They believed those would apply to the states through the 14th Amendment. And slowly but surely, the courts, over years, have incorporated those rights as applying to the state. So when you go into federal court in the state, you can indeed enforce those rights. You enforce them against the state. They have to comply. Fundamentalists don't believe these should apply. You could take a state like, say, Utah, where it's predominantly the Mormon religion. You could start a state tax where the people of everybody in Utah would have to pay to support that religion. You could bar any other religion from existing in the state. You could do all kinds of things. You could go to Mississippi and say, we have our own timetable for speedy trials, particularly when minorities are involved. It would just so dramatically change the nature. This is just one area. It runs across the board. It is pro these justifications for what will be a body of law. It won't happen overnight, but it'll happen pretty quickly. And this court is moving already. The four who are there are occasionally able to get one of the other justices to join them, Kennedy principally, to join them in pushing this law. And the conservatives on the court have spent years already building the foundation to take this body of law to the next step. It isn't complex stuff. It's stuff that candidates could explain very easily in the next election, and not explain it in the terms that Nixon used it or other Republicans have used it, where we're going to get you a justice who will be a racist and will keep blacks from doing this, that, and the other things, as Nixon did in the South, but rather for a justice who is going to take care of, be tough on law and order and favor prosecutors and be opposed to civil liberties plaintiffs. It's basic issues. Do you want to change the law that no political branch could dare change through the court? It's a big issue. So that issue and the issue I started with, process, the fact that Democrats have ignored process. Election and the platform in 2004, when I looked at all the platforms back to 1960, the 2004 Democratic platform is the first one that has no process issue in it. Not that platforms are vital, but they at least show some thinking of the party. No process issues. This is just absurd. This is too important to the way the machinery of government works for Democrats not to be calling Republicans on their gaming the system, and that's exactly what they're doing. And you're getting had by it. Now, as I say, people might not know what a motion to recommit is, they may not know what a cloture vote is, but I think most people know when they're getting screwed. And you're getting screwed. So I think these need to be issues on 2008, and I'm going to continue pounding the drum. That's why I'm down here tonight, to make a few pounds on the drum. Thank you all. Keep your questions tight and don't give speeches. We can roll through a lot of...
Wait a second. Is this mic working back there?
Yeah.
Okay, good. What we're going to try to do so everybody hear the questions is pass the mic around. So I'll start here, please.
I have a real light question for you. When do you think the Republicans are going to ask the Pope to canonize Ronald Reagan?
You mean they haven't? The question was, when did I think that the Republicans were going to ask the Pope to canonize Ronald Reagan? And my response was, you mean they haven't? I think his state funeral was one of the opening bids to take him towards sainthood.
Martha Stout.
Incidentally, that reminds me of something. I'm working on because it's writing worse than Watergate, I'm under a tremendous deadline right now. I don't know how I scheduled myself to be out here giving talks when I have a manuscript due at the end of December. And I have them all through November. The schedule lightens up in December. But I've been working on a book that I discovered material when I was working on Conservatives Without Conscience. The senator had told me, look at my files. I think you'll find a lot of stuff. I did. I went over, that's how I traced what happened to the conservative movement, because he felt great responsibility for the conservative movement and great distress about it. In fact, he told me when I first called him, he said, he said, John, he said, I've been down in Washington, now that Clinton's been elected, and shooting fire right across the bow of my former colleagues, because I think it's unconscionable what they're doing is incivility, and the attacks on Hillary make no sense to me. They're going to drive good people out of office, and my colleagues aren't very happy with that, but they're even, I won't use the exact word he used back in Arizona, when he said the powers that be there were even more annoyed with him because he had endorsed a Democrat, a woman who was running in the 6th district, against a man. He told me, he said, I think he's a right-wing nut, John, and he scares me. I don't want to see him go to Washington, plus he doesn't know anything about Arizona, and he also claims to be my heir apparent. And I made sure that the voters understood that wasn't true. But let me tell you what happened. As soon as I did that, the powers that be came to see me. And they said, Senator, we built this big headquarters in downtown Phoenix. It's got your name on it. It's the Berry and Goldwater Republican headquarters. If you keep doing what you're doing, we're going to have to take your name off that building. Well, the senator, as you might expect, didn't take too kindly to that, and he said, well, gentlemen, let me tell you what I feel about this. If you keep doing what you're doing, I hope you will take my name off the building.
Yes, Martha Stout has written a book called The Paranoia Switch, where she points out that she feels that our nation went into collective post-traumatic stress disorder after 9/11. And I wondered if the sociologists that you have looked at or worked with have found any correlation there or noticed anything like that.
I didn't really ask that specific question, and I don't recall that coming up in my research. I only recall the data they had found, how many more authoritarian followers had been tested and found in the aftermath of 9/11. People wanting somebody to think for them, somebody they could not have to labor about these things, somebody who made them feel comfortable, and of course all those authoritarian types that jumped out in front were pretty hard authoritarian conservatives. What's interesting about these findings is that not all conservatives are authoritarians, but all highly ranking authoritarians are highly conservative. It's a very interesting bit of information, both the leaders and the followers. So it was a body of information I wasn't looking for, but it is so explanatory of how the Republican Party operates and their mentality today, and why they don't want a big tent. They don't want people who don't think like them. They're uncomfortable around people who don't think like them. And that's why I suspect you read headlines like I happened to see about 2+ weeks ago, where on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, which made me sure that Murdoch hadn't taken over the paper yet, too. It was a above-the-fold headline about the significant number of economic and business conservatives who have left the Republican Party. And we're talking big numbers. We're talking 7-8% here. And they're taking their checkbooks with them. A lot of the reasons they're leaving are the reasons I put in broken government. And everything from the fact that they don't like the incompetence, they're businessmen, they know how to run an operation, and they see people who are running Washington, and they find that offensive, and they don't want any part of them. They don't think the social issues of the religious right and the social conservatives demand be front and center are the most important issues facing the country. They don't give a hoot about whether gay marriage is an issue or not, because they don't think it's important to the well-being of this country. They think the fiscal irresponsibility of this party has been devastating. while Bush has seemed to have gotten religion as soon as he got out of, he lost to Congress, where he would sign, he didn't veto anything they had to offer. It's just a make show now, and they know that. It's his effort to, it was a devastating piece about how the desertion of people as time has gone on. So the first answer is I didn't find anybody with post-traumatic stress syndrome joining those ranks. I just found lots of people who didn't stay, so they probably were not very true authoritarian personalities. Most of them have gone back. You have about a core of, as I said, about 25% of the American people who are solid. You look at the polls, for example, of who never left Nixon, who has never left Bush, and you scratch a little bit into that, and you'll see authoritarian conservatives at work. Yes?
Will you please comment on the use by Bush of the signing statements to undermine the rule of law and expand the power of the presidency?
Signing statements are nothing new. They go back to Andrew Jackson. We have never had, I remember some of Nixon's statements where he was upset where Congress was asking him to spend money he didn't want to spend, but he didn't want to repeal the bill, so he would issue a signing statement. Although he did spend the money, he would just say it was over his objection, it was being spent. The real issue with Bush, who has issued so many signing statements, and we don't have the answer to this, and I believe Conyers at the House Judiciary Committee is working on this. John Conyers came to Congress while I was still the chief minority counsel of that committee, and I've known him for a lot of years. He's a mild-mannered man who is tough as steel. One should not be fooled by Conyers at all. He's a team player too, though. But he has hired extra staff to dig out what is really the important issue. If Bush has indeed not enforced all the laws that he claims are objectionable by his signing statements, it would be such a breach of his oath of office that I don't think that Nancy Pelosi could do anything other than put impeachment on the table as fast as she does.
Please speak to the qualities of those Democratic candidates who you would support.
Well, my support doesn't mean anything. I've been approached by both sides over the years, and I am a total nonpartisan. I have no affiliation with either party. As you know, here in California, we register either Republican, Democrat, or unaffiliated. I'm unaffiliated. When pollsters call, I say I'm an independent. I really am only a partisan for one thing, and that's good government. And I see government that, and I try not to say this is my opinion where government has gone wrong, where I take my knowledge of the way it works. Almost was stunning when I went back and looked at 7 years of columns I had written for Fine Law. Almost every column, to my surprise, deals with process. Almost every book I have written deals with process. And I'd never really stopped to think about it, that I know how important that is to, one, the way the government operates, and two, the way people understand their government. That it's just been a natural thing for me to do. There has been very little conversation so far on process. Hillary got asked a question by a new publication, which I can commend to you. It's just come online. You all have probably heard of the United Kingdom's Guardian publication. Well, they now have something called Guardian America. If you Google it, it'll come right up. It openly admits it is for progressive and liberal causes and trying to bring those people's attention. But it also, more importantly, the editor of it, Michael Tomansky, has said he's going to ask questions that he notices the mainstream press doesn't ask of candidates, and has been doing so. And what's he been asking? Process questions. And he asked Hillary one about the power gained by, one of his first interviews, gained by the Bush-Cheney White House, and asked her what she thought. And she was very, I'm just summarizing, but she thought it was a pure power grab and troublesome. And Kamansky was a little bit surprised. He came back with and asked her, do you think any president would ever give up any power? And without a heartbeat, she said, absolutely, which is a little encouraging. It hasn't exactly stimulated a debate, but it is the first sign I've seen of it. Edwards has been talking about process, particularly of late. Obama I've heard very little out of. On the Republican side, they don't talk about it. They just do it. They just do it. Rudy talks a little bit about it and how he's going to do more than Bush and Cheney have done. But other than that, I also told my wife that Rudy's the only one who can keep me in the genre.
I called Dianne Feinstein's office today to express my concern about her vote over the PC committee vote, and also to express my disgust that she doesn't seem to see a problem with giving the telecoms amnesty after the fact of breaking the law. And of course, it's not just Feinstein. I'm just disgusted with a lot of the politicians in Congress, and I can't understand why they aren't furious about all the illegalities that are being committed. I mean, what's wrong with these people?
I was dumbfounded when both, I wasn't as surprised that Schumer went for Casey since he had first offered him. Feinstein, I just didn't get it. I mean, I don't know if there was some horse trading that we'll never know of, that occurred behind the scenes, that got that vote. That is always possible, let me assure you. It cannot be ruled out. The explanations the two of them gave, Schumer in the New York Times, Feinstein in a press statement, were pretty pathetic, frankly. They didn't make much sense. Saying that, well, we might get a worse person in than this one. What I saw, the most troublesome thing is it's sort of a concession that waterboarding may be okay. And have we really sunk to that point? I hope not. Or that, that we will immunize a corporation that will help us when we, let me tell you something. I can't believe those telecoms. I know how the White House works. I can't believe that the general counsel of one or more of those telecom companies did not call Alberto Gonzalez or somebody and say, listen, we want a written assurance that what we're doing has been authorized by the president or the attorney general and that we don't have any legal exposure. There's no lawyer in the world who is more protective of his client than a corporate counsel. We don't have all the facts on this yet. If they just don't have so much as a hearing and give these people immunity, it's quite remarkable that a president who has a lower approval rating than Richard Nixon can get a Democratic Congress to do what he wants. Think about that.
Yes, I wonder if you could discuss the use of executive privilege during your time in the White House and the Nixon administration. Was there ever any thought of using that to prevent you or others from testifying during the hearings? And how do you compare and contrast that to the subsequent presidencies, in particular under the Bush administration?
Well, there was initially Nixon invoked privilege around me when I told him that he couldn't do it for criminal activity. There's no attorney. He said attorney-client privilege. He said it doesn't cover it. It's one of the exceptions to the attorney-client privilege. And I said I doubt if it covers a grand jury who's asking the president for information because they are constitutional co-equals, and I'm not sure you could get away with that, as the Supreme Court would later say. The Bush administration has very interestingly almost never invoked the privilege. They've gone through, it's not unlike Bush 1. They go through all the dance steps of preventing the information from coming forward without ever using the words. And that's what they're getting away with right now, because no one's forcing the issue. The House has recently sent to the floor the contempt citation for Harriet Mier and John Bolton, the chief of staff, Harriet Mier, the former counsel, who didn't even honor the subpoena. They didn't even show up, which is a new low in how can we go into your face and insult you. And we'll see what happens on that. If the House doesn't vote to hold those two people in contempt, even though the administration has said, we won't prosecute them. And that's the way the procedure works. After the House votes contempt, it's referred to the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia under the statute. The U.S. Attorney under Gonzales was instructed that he should do nothing with it. I haven't looked at whether Casey was asked this question. It probably did come up during his confirmation. I'm sure it did. I just haven't had a chance to dig it out. But I'm sure that the White House would he hasn't run in yet probably to David Addington unless he was briefed by him as to giving the wrong answer on torture early in his first day of hearing, and then heard from him the second day on the telephone and did 180 on, he suddenly barely even had ever heard of waterboarding. But it'll be interesting. I don't know what they're going to do with executive privilege. The Congress has got the upper hand on this. It is never really a purely legal issue. It is a political issue that is resolved politically. We have never sent anybody to jail. What I have been advocating for a long time is that the House and the Senate dust off some very old machinery that's sitting down in the basement of both House and Senate. Oil up that machinery where they have the ability to have their own contempt proceedings by each body. It was done in the past. There's lots of precedent for it. They can actually send somebody to jail. Obviously, they subcontracted, maybe the Blackwater, I don't know. And they can execute their own sentences. They can do it for the life of the Congress. That's the extent of it. But they each, in fact, I did read some interesting dicta from one of Scalia's opinions, where he indeed acknowledged that each body, the president, each of the branches, has the inherent power to enforce its own rules and regulations. So we'll see where this goes. It's still early.
I'd like to get your thoughts on what seems to be one of the most troubling, to me, aspects of the Mukasey issue, which was Senator Schumer's comment, which I agree was very weak, was that he had a private meeting with Mukasey, and Mukasey said, well, if there's a law specifically banning waterboarding, I assuredly will uphold that law and prosecute against it. And what seems particularly troubling about this is that it's opening the door to, well, if it's not specifically codified as law, therefore we don't have to do anything about it. In other words, taking it away from what would be considered generally accepted practices and ideals and forcing narrowly targeted legislation for every little single issue. So I'd like your thoughts on that particular aspect.
I can give a very quick and easy answer to that. There is no question that waterboarding is currently outlawed under the existing statute that was adopted to implement the Geneva Convention. It couldn't be clearer. It's in the legislative history. It's there. And it's even earlier than that law. We prosecuted people after World War II in the Philippines for waterboarding specifically. So it's just not even an issue today. The fact that, maybe just make the point they should adopt a statute just to specifically address that. It wouldn't be, or either that or you could do a concurrent resolution. Both bodies say we've already done it, and we just want to make sure that everybody understands that we've done it. You can't veto a concurrent resolution either.
There's a tremendous amount of historical precedent about where we are today. Look back through history and see the change. Italy, or at that time Rome, and was taking all the way up. We have our blueprint for the takeover starting with Ronald Reagan, and it's already here. My concern is, how do you undo the propaganda machine, mainly Fox News and all the others who skew it, in conjunction with the government for media control, for information coming to people, and get back to some kind of position where we as simple citizens can get the right information, make the right decision, and hold the leaders accountable.
One of the reasons that I've mentioned I've written the books I have is because I didn't think they were being covered by the mainstream media. I've asked over the years why that's happened. Why aren't we being informed? Why do we have to dig and find this information? What have you? I've got a number of answers. First of all, the White House press corps is a whole different generation. There are people there today who are so young and maybe so untrained they can't tell you which happened first, Teapot Dome or Watergate. They've never even heard of Iran-Contra. So their antenna isn't quivering for a lot of this stuff. Secondly, I'm told that while there are old-timers there, the whole corporate media has affected people, not as I expected, in their editors spiking stories they didn't like, but rather just putting so much workload on the daily working journalist. They don't have time to do any kind of investigative working. A person like Bob Woodward, for example, is still on the masthead of the Washington Post and is there, but Bob doesn't do any data journalism. He spends his full time doing research for his books, and then he gives that back to the paper and lets them run with it. So that's a problem for them. They don't. A number of them told me, we wish we had the kind of time you did to dig out what you are digging out of your books. So there is almost no investigative journalism today. It's passé. So that doesn't help to inform you. The most compelling reason, I was told, that journalists today are not keeping people informed is that the Bush administration, certainly in the first 6 years, was very effective at just simply stiffing them, telling them if they wrote a story they didn't like, they would cut them off from any further interviews. And this is the lifeblood of these reporters on the White House press corps. They have to get additional interviews. They have to get more than is being passed out at the news briefings or at the trough. And they're not getting their calls answered when they indeed don't write stories that are to their favor. And it's certainly during the first, 5.5 years. It's gotten a little looser lately because he doesn't hold as many formal press conferences. But when I had a friend who's a fairly seasoned reporter who went to the second East Room press conference. And he said it's quite amazing, John. At first we had to hand in our questions before, and we were allowed one follow-up question. We were then taken into the East Room 2 by 2 to assigned seats. And the reason they took us in 2 by 2 is to make sure we got in our assigned seat. Because clearly they took them a nanosecond to figure out. The president had the questions, he had a seating chart on his podium, he knew exactly which questions to ask of which reporters. He had the whole thing in short was scripted. I asked why didn't any reporters write about this? Well, they knew they would burn their bridge, and they just couldn't afford to do it. So this is one of the underlying reasons that you're not getting the information. And the reason I'm a glass half full person, while I understand a lot of people are highly apathetic about participation. This group is not in that category. You come out, you're interested, you want to learn. But many people could care less. We, as a nation, ever since polling started in the 30s, have ranked somewhere around 30, 35, maybe 40 occasionally, but typically in the low 30s of people who are actively interested in voting and participating in the system. We rank in the world's democracies just about at the bottom. We're, I think, about a notch above Zambia, where we come in. A brand new democracy where we have been a terrible record. I long ago, after reading, I can't tell you how many studies I've read over the years of what will stimulate people to get interested in voting. Deliberative democracy, more information, more civics courses in high school. All these explanations, none of them seem to work. So I came to the conclusion that people have a right, if they want to be bad citizens, if they want to be irresponsible citizens, that's their total right to do so. Because I'm convinced enough people are interested and are active that serve as cues for others and proxies that the system is working. Not perfectly, but it is working satisfactorily. While it is in essence somewhat of an elite group because it's an informed group, it is representative and not without thought of what might affect your neighbor or your friend or your family. So I do think that, in fact, we don't have a fully functioning democracy. We obviously always have a republic anyway. What I see is more of a failure as congressional districts have grown from the early years of, say, 1 in 30,000 to 1 in the average district now being 650,000. Those are huge districts to try to service. And these members are overworked, and they have lost their educational function and their leadership function in taking issues to the people.
What we're going to try to do is work in these few remaining questions. But for those of you who have not yet had a chance to buy some of these books and would like to, we are in a tight time situation with regard to this venue, and we'll have to be out of this.
We can get moving faster.
So, if any of you would like to purchase books, please feel free to do so, but we're going to move through these remaining questions quickly.
Thank you again, Mr. Dean, for coming. I eagerly look forward to reading the books I purchased tonight. I waited in line 20 minutes to ask you a question. I wanted to have the gentleman in front of me ask pretty much what I had in mind. Because I do believe that the Fourth Estate has really abrogated its responsibilities to society. My second question to you then would be, if you could comment on the similarities that you see in how the Bush administration has used propaganda in order to get its way, the same way that the Nazi regime did in the early 30s.
Well, I haven't finished Naomi Wolf's book, where she takes and analyzes the 10 keys of what she believes the road to fascism. I did look at fascism quite deeply when I wrote Conservatives Without Conscience. I differ with her on a lot of issues because I don't think we're there yet. I think if you can take, yes, you can take isolated examples, but you can't make I think it's the difference between a social scientist and a lawyer. I would not want to take her case to court, if you will, and try to persuade a jury of 12 independent-minded people who are testing the evidence through aggressive cross-examination as making the case. We're not there. We're not on the road to fascism. The propaganda has been effective. They are very good at their image making. They're as good as anybody we've seen. And I think that each president seems to learn a little bit more.
Yes, I have a question on the fake voting machines. How can we have a democracy as long as one of these machines exists? It should be an insult to every American.
Right. I think the big issue on voting machines is obviously the ability to audit them, to keep a paper trail in case they need to be tested. When you think about the difficulty in our election makeup, where we have every county, every state, and so many different systems, to throw an election on a national basis, even with the screwed up electoral college we've got, is a very, very difficult, if not impossible thing to do. It's not that the system works, but let us not throw out what is workable as we head towards good, because we're never going to get the perfect. So I'm concerned about the issue, but I just don't think that there's the wherewithal. These are serious felonies in every state to throw an election. And I just don't think people are that clever. I think I see screw-ups, and I see people taking advantage of the problems with the system. Blackwell in Ohio is a classic example, but I just don't see it as a national problem right now, where there's anybody who has the ability to absolutely
It is one.
possible.
It is one. It's a national problem. You've been in it.
Well, it is a national problem. Yeah, I agree, and I know people are not. Let me tell you, this is where I try to share what I know, and I've investigated this 2 or 3 times, and I know people aren't always happy when I don't come out on the right side of the issue on this, but I've looked at it. I try to look at it as an honest information broker, and I'm trying to tell you that I don't believe, and I don't believe anybody has ever made the case, you can throw a national election based on voting fraud.
Please keep studying.
With your knowledge of this country, with your experience saying that your glass is half full gives me some hope. What series of events must happen to keep your glass half full?
My glass is half full. What I do is to make sure that I understand. In fact, somebody told me the other night after reading Broken Government, they said, "John, you're the first conservative I've ever met who quotes Noam Chomsky." And I do that because he tends to be such a realist. I want to make sure that I'm well-grounded. I don't know if it's nature, nurture. I don't know why I'm a glass half full, but it is certainly, I happen to have a belief that when I look at the American people and they have the information, I look at often at the jury system and how it's worked, where I have a lot of experience. You give 12 people who may or not, they're probably all from different walks of life. They don't particularly want to be in that jury room. When they get that assignment, some of them will serve for long runs on complex cases. They will have the facts as solidly presented as they can through the adversary process that happens under the rules of evidence. So it's good information. It's as good as the system can get. And 99 out of 100 times they reach the right decision. They don't convict, or they do convict, or they find claimant guilty or innocent, or these are, and it just repeatedly, it's a microcosm of the ability of Americans, like I say, from all walks of life, to make solid decisions. 99, I would trust a jury 99 out of 100 times. Yes, there are always exceptions, but I'm saying just on the run of the mill. And I think that's true. We saw it in 06. People finally started getting the message that things were astray in Washington. And I think if you look at the tremendous number of people who are leaving the ranks of the Republican Party, who no longer claim any allegiance, notwithstanding a concerted effort by Karl Rove and the Bush White House with tons of money and using earmarks, unidentified earmarks in gobs and billions spending to try to make a permanent Republican majority, and they failed. They failed miserably. People got it. They got it. Last question.
Could you shed some light on what happened with Kucinich and the Cheney impeachment? Because I was very confused. I heard on Air America and saw it on C-SPAN and then never heard anything. And is there anything that we should do to help them?
The question is on what happened on the Kucinich impeachment. First of all, it's a privileged motion that you can raise because of its seriousness. Obviously, it takes a maverick to raise it because this is something clearly the leadership did not want raised. Until I have actually read the full congressional record, which I actually printed out today, and it's quite voluminous and quite interesting. I didn't see it on C-SPAN, and I can read it faster than I can watch it. I really don't know exactly all of the maneuvers, but I'm told that a guy by the name of John Shattuck over in, this is one of my Washington sources told me, who's a kind of a behind-the-scenes operator, said, hey, let's fold. Let's swing the other way, the Republicans, and make them actually debate this on the floor when the leadership doesn't want it. And then the leadership got wind of that, and they sent it back to the Judiciary Committee. That's, in a nutshell, what happened. So, but it was gamesmanship, is what it was.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join with me in thanking John Day for his